Hello, and thanks for joining us. I'm Brad Lubben. I'm an Extension Policy Specialist here in the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and a fellow in our Center for Ag Profitability. We're pleased to have you join us today, and we continue to have a few more participants roll in, but I think we've reached the threshold here to begin today's discussion. Today is part of our weekly webinar series here with the Center for Ag Profitability, typically every Thursday live at noon here Central Time. We appreciate you participating today and invite you to look ahead at what we have coming for future webinars. You can also always look back at what we have previously done in our archive. The schedule and the archive are both available on our website at cap.unl.edu or cap.unl.edu. Today's program is focused on USDA drought assistance programs and their relevance for producers here in 2023. With drought conditions already with us and lingering from years already by, USDA is already working with farmers and ranchers across the state who are experiencing those impacts of drought. This webinar will address some of those disaster programs most relevant to current drought conditions, and it will talk about some of the information needed to apply and the record keeping that producers might have to help with their application and their management decisions ahead. We're glad to be joined today by three presenters. Two of them are from the USDA Farm Service Agency, Nebraska State Office. Patrick Lechner is the Chief of Price Support, Conservation, and Environmental Programs. Pat's with us to talk about the assistance programs we have available for producers and to remind us about how the process works, including the steps necessary for producers. Ben Herink is a farm loan specialist with the State Office of FSA, and Ben will cover some of the drought disaster designations, the process, because that process is critical in triggering emergency loan program opportunities and eligibility for producers through the FSA Emergency Loan Program. So Pat and Ben, it's a pleasure to have you both join us from FSA. We also are joined by Shannon Sand. Yep, go ahead, Pat. Yeah.
I was just going to say, great to be on, Brad.
Great. We are also pleased to be joined by Shannon Sand. Shannon is one of our newest extension educators in Nebraska Extension. Shannon is an extension ag economist with our Center for Ag Profitability, who just recently started at the West Central Research Extension and Education Center in North Platte. Shannon joined us a couple months ago and brings quite a bit of extension experience and knowledge here to the discussion today. Shannon will talk about some of the record keeping needs and management principles for producers that can help them prepare for these programs and also for the decisions they need to make given the conditions we see. Shannon, it's pleased to have you join us as well.
Thank you.
So we're going to turn it over to Pat here to start, but I want to invite the audience, please, at any time to submit a question that you might have via the Q&A box. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll find a Q&A icon, and please submit your questions as we go. We will actually sort of take questions and have some discussion sort of topic by topic as we go through here, but please don't hesitate to send your questions as soon as you see them. So with that, I'm ready to turn it over to Pat and welcome you to share your screen and start the presentation.
Okay, let me just make sure I'm off mute here. And can everyone see my screen? Brad, are we good to go?
We now see the presentation slide. That looks good.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. And as we highlight kind of our drought portfolio with the Farm Service Agency, we've got quite an array of programs. We're going to highlight 5 of them today in particular and give sort of an overview of what those programs entail and a little bit about eligibility and the process of applying for those programs. So the first 3 that I'm going to highlight are going to be the Livestock Forage Disaster Program, known as LFP, the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program, which is ELAP, and then some flexibilities that we have with the Conservation Reserve Program under the emergency hang and grazing provisions. I'm then going to kick it over to Ben, and he's going to talk about the emergency loans and the disaster set-aside loans. Just a couple of programs I'll just quick highlight on that are also part of the portfolio would be ECP, the Emergency Conservation Program. We utilize that with water and facilities under drought conditions. We've got the Tree Assistance Program, which targets ornamental tree farms and specialty crops like that. And then we've got the Non-Insured Crop Disaster Assistance Program, known as NAP, which is our catastrophic level insurance policy for crops that are not eligible for RMA coverage. One quick note I just wanted to make on NAP is that recently we've received some flexibilities under NAP, in particular targeting historically underserved producers and socially disadvantaged producers. Producers that meet that criteria and have certified on a CCC 860, which is a self-certification form, that they meet that criteria, whether it's beginning farmer, rancher, and veteran farmer, or any other criteria, whether it's gender, ethnicity, that falls into under that historically underserved tag. If you've filed that certification form, that's an automatic coverage under catastrophic NAP policy. Now, obviously, you would have to plant one of those crops that's eligible for NAP, but if you've planted one of those crops and you have an 860 on file, you automatically have NAP coverage now. So that's a really new process that was put into place. It's targeting a specific group and getting them the coverage, hopefully, that they need without having to go through the process of understanding it, of knowing that it's there and applying for it. They've already have that coverage if they did file that. They would then have the opportunity to opt into it and go through with it, or opt out if they choose that's something they don't want to go through with. So just wanted to quick highlight that before we get going here. So for the majority, if not all of our disaster portfolio, we use the U.S. Drought Monitor as a triggering mechanism. And each program in itself uses the Drought Monitor in a little bit different way. Whether it's in the grazing season, we have to meet certain criteria for drought to release LFP, and we'll talk about that. How ELAP also uses the Drought Monitor. Emergency hang and grazing under CRP uses the Drought Monitor. So this tool is really the key in determining whether these programs open up and are available to producers. Right now, as of last week, for LFP, we had 66 counties that I believe that were eligible for 65 counties that were eligible for LFP under native and improved pasture. And we had 68 counties that triggered for small grains grazing LFP. As of last week, we have 87 counties that met the criteria to implement ELAP. And then all of our counties in Nebraska have met the criteria to release CRP acres for emergency hang and grazing. And we'll talk about those triggers under emergency hang and grazing as we move forward. So the first program we're going to talk about is the Livestock Disaster Program, Livestock Forage Disaster Program, or known as LFP. LFP provides financial assistance to livestock producers who suffered grazing losses due to an eligible drought condition. As I had mentioned before, the U.S. Drought Monitor is the triggering mechanism that determines whether or not LFP is implemented. The key criteria for eligibility for LFP is that a producer must have risk in eligible livestock and also risk in eligible grazing lands. So that is the key factor in determining eligibility for LFP purposes. A few other notes on LFP as far as eligibility. Those eligible livestock that we're looking at have to be grazing animals. Those livestock must have been or would have been grazing eligible grazing lands during the normal grazing season. So there would have had to at least been an intent to put those eligible livestock on grazing lands. Livestock must have been owned, leased, purchased, or contracted during the 60 days prior to the beginning date of the qualifying drought. So that time frame would be when we hit the criteria in the grazing season to open up LFP. It would have had to have been within 60 days prior to that date. Livestock must be maintained for commercial purposes. We did see a little bit of flexibility regarding this criteria for eligible livestock. We now also include recreational livestock that contribute to the viability of a commercial operation. So a perfect example would be if you've got a ranch and you have horses that you use as part of that ranching operation that ultimately contributes to the livestock and the viability of that commercial operation, we can include those in an LFP application. Feedlot animals are not eligible under LFP because LFP is designed as a grazing lands program. Wanted to make note of mitigated livestock when we're looking at counties that have qualified for LFP and the drought conditions in multi-year forms. So if we've got counties that have qualified for multiple years of LFP, and as a result of the drought conditions, they've had to sell off some of their herd or sell off livestock, those can be included in an LFP application and will be accounted for. Continuing on with eligibility, producers must provide pasture land or grazing land for covered livestock, and that's including owned, leased land. But the most significant part of that is they must have risk in that grazing land. And then the second criteria for that would be producers are required to file an acreage report on the grazing lands for which grazing losses are being claimed. When you go in and complete an LFP application, those acres that were certified to that producer as eligible grazing lands will come across onto that LFP application and be reflected directly on that application. So that's why that requirement's there to report those acres during acreage reporting season, so that when we open up that LFP application, those acres will carry over to the application itself. When we look at payment factors and how payments work for the livestock forage program, inside of these grazing seasons, if we hit D2 for 8 consecutive weeks, that automatically qualifies for a 1-month payment factor. If a county hits D3 on the drought monitor at any time, we're looking at a 3-month payment factor. If we've got D3 for 4 weeks during the grazing season, we've got a 4-month payment factor. D4 at any time during the grazing season would be the 4-month payment factor again. And then if a county would be in D4 for 4 weeks during the grazing season, we would hit that cap of a 5-month payment factor. Beginning dates of the grazing seasons may differ, whether we're looking at native and improved pasture, which we have 1 grazing season for that, but we also have a small grains grazing season. So you may see some different dates that qualify payment factors, some different dates of when we start to implement these programs. That's kind of a really high level overview of LFP. Just wanted to make sure that we got the information out there generally of how the triggering mechanism works, the payment factors, and I'll pass it over to you, Brad, if there's any questions.
Pat, absolutely. We are starting to get some questions, but I want to take the prerogative and ask sort of the first one. Can you explain this question of producers must show risk or have risk in both the livestock and the pasture? Risk is not necessarily the same thing as ownership, but can you explain what that is and how they document or demonstrate that?
Yep, exactly. So in particular, as we kind of had mentioned with livestock, owned livestock, leased livestock, under contract livestock, that would be the general eligibility for risk under the livestock. Where we see some differences and some rules that we need to adhere by would be those risks in the grazing land. Some of the documentation that can be provided that would show risk in that grazing land would be a written lease. If we have those, that shows that producer or that rancher has risk in those grazing acres at the time of the qualifying disaster or that drought condition. Recognizing that we've got a lot of verbal leases out there across the state, FSA does provide an 855 or a CCC 855, which is an annual lease certification form where if an owner and an operator have a lease agreement that's verbal only, they can complete this 855 that would recognize and acknowledge that the operator did have risk in those acres. So those are just the two primary that we see. When we're talking about risk in acres, one main criteria would be the ability to graze those acres at the time of the disaster event. We also would take into consideration some other factors, and our committees have the flexibility to do that. Whether it's an operator being in charge of maintaining the fences, maintaining the water, making improvement to those grassland acres. That can also constitute as a risk when looking at eligibility for LFP.
So Pat, let me also build on that slide where you talked about what producers had to do. You also mentioned they have to file an acreage report. So explain that producers are reporting acres on which the grazing losses have occurred that they're claiming assistance. But the losses and the assistance itself is a function of the livestock owned, not the acres themselves, right?
It's a combination, but really what we're looking at is the grazing acres lost. And so that livestock owner obviously would have eligible livestock, but where we're really looking at is did that operator or did that livestock owner have risk in those grazing acres?
And understood, yeah. But in terms of the calculation is a function of animals, right?
It can be it's the lesser of the two. It's the lesser of the carrying capacity on that grass, or It also factors in the animals as well. Yes.
Okay. So then that does actually expand further into this question. Is there a standard rating for carrying capacity, or is that a sort of a pasture by pasture calculation?
That's a great question. Our carrying capacities on acres are by county and by type of grass or forage, and those are established by our state committee and reviewed annually. Those are set here by our Nebraska State Committee, who reviews those carrying capacities for each county and then ultimately sets those.
So, for example, a producer has asked a question here, or at least an attendee has asked a question. Someone that has a practice that includes silvopasture, some combination of managed grass and tree. There's a carrying capacity in that county. That carrying capacity isn't specifically affected by the management practice on that farm.
Yeah, well, it can be. What we're really looking at in those senses is whether or not that carrying capacity, if that grass had something done to improve it, to increase its carrying capacity.
Okay.
Tree cover would not ultimately be one of those. But if there was enhancements to that acreage, whether it was fertilization, things like that, we may look at a capacity that would increase that carrying capacity.
Okay. All right. And a series of questions sort of relate to so much of the state is already eligible for assistance given the D2 and greater rankings that we're in right now. In fact, you have to really go down to the southeastern corner of the state to find something that isn't technically in a drought at the moment, and a few areas of the state that are in the D1 category. But fundamentally, given that much of the state is eligible today, but conditions, if they continue, mean that that producer might be eligible not just for the initial single payment, 1 month payment for D2, but maybe a 3-month payment or a 4-month payment. Should they apply now? Should they wait until the season's over and we've sort of capped out on what the potential payment is, or how does that process work? When should they start the process?
Yep, sure. So the final date to apply for LFP assistance for 2023 would be the end of January of 2024. However, if that assistance is needed now, we encourage everyone to come into the office, apply for LFP, regardless of whether or not a county may currently qualify for only a 1-month payment or a 3-month payment. As those conditions worsen in the county and we reach the next tier of eligibility and payment factors, those payments are automatically generated as we reach that criteria and then reissued out. Ultimately, my suggestion would be If those funds are needed now to support their operation, they should sure go ahead and apply now. And as those payment factors increase, FSA and the local offices will ultimately account for that and issue those additional payments.
Okay. And Pat, there's a combined election, and Ben may actually get to some of the emergency designation here to come, but LFP is triggered by the drought monitor and the determination of where the county is on the drought monitor. The question becomes, does a majority of the county have to be within a certain drought designation, or is it any component, any part of the county? How is that technically determined?
Yep, that's a good question. It would only be any part of the county. So it can be the smallest to the largest amount of that county. If it meets that criteria, it will release it for the entirety of the county.
Okay. Let me take another question here too, because this is a critical part of what we're really talking about today. Another question too, and then we'll get into the next part of your presentation there, Pat. The question is, one is related to an insurance question. We know the producers do have pasture, range, and forage insurance coverage available, in addition to NAP if they had enrolled in NAP. Does PRF coverage or NAP coverage affect their eligibility for LFP, or are those separate and distinct programs?
That's a good question. Can you hear me all right, Brad?
I can hear you. It looks like your video is frozen, but I can hear you.
Yeah, I think I froze up here. I'm going to try to get us back in here.
Okay.
But to answer that question, yes, they've recently adjusted some of those rules with LFP and the access to some of that funding. There used to be the ineligibility to have NAP coverage and LFP coverage, but they did now allow for both of those.
Okay. So participation in those doesn't directly impact or limit your eligibility for LFP.
Exactly right. Yep.
All right. One more question that let me ask at the moment relates to mitigated cattle. You had a slide in the discussion on mitigated cattle. Part of the question is, if we're talking about mitigated cattle during the time period that's covered by the drought and by the LFP eligibility, that can include cattle that mitigated cattle are effectively cattle that are not grazing there because they've already had to have been moved, liquidated, or because of reduced capacity, not put out to pasture, not sent out to pasture this spring. Can you clarify again briefly sort of how mitigated cattle count and how one determines how many mitigated cattle there might be?
Yeah. So ultimately, that's going to be the producer's certification to let us know. But if those livestock were sold, if we're looking at a multi-year LFP issue, and those livestock were sold as a direct result of the drought conditions, when we're looking at accounting for those, when you file an LFP application, you're ultimately going to put how many number of head you intended to graze or that you did have graze. But we also have the opportunity to account for livestock that were mitigated that we can put on that application that may ultimately increase the payment amount and account for those.
Okay. All right, Pat, thank you for that. Let me see if you're able to share your screen again. Let's move on to the ELAP discussion and continue the discussions with more questions to come.
Brad, I actually got kicked out of my laptop, and it wants to make me restart before it'll let me log in. But do you think Ryan, can we pull up the slides? I know Ryan has them.
If Ryan has them, I'll see if he can grab them for us.
Yep, give me one moment here. I'll get those for us.
Okay.
This is valuable, and getting out to everybody here via Zoom is efficient and convenient. It always comes with its technicalities, but a little delay here beats trying to get everybody together in one meeting room, given the information we're trying to get out to the state. All right, Ryan, that puts you in control of the presentation. So we'll move on 2 more slides.
Okay.
I'm sorry, two more now.
Oh, okay, there we go.
There we go. Okay, back to Pat.
Okay, perfect. So the next here, what we're going to talk about is ELAP, which is the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program. And what ELAP is designed to do is provide financial assistance to producers facing drought conditions. And this is a little bit different than LFP, where we're looking at the straight grazing loss and the loss of the forage. And here we're going to look at additional ways to compensate producers that are also suffering from drought conditions. So there's four main criteria that we would look at. One for livestock would be additional mileage for transporting livestock feed above normal. So if producers are having to go additional miles beyond what they normally would to get access to feed, we're looking at a way to compensate that. Additionally, if we're having additional expenses for moving livestock to feed, so if we're having to go additional miles to get those animals to pasture, we could take a look at compensating those miles as well. Third, water transportation. So that would be bringing water in to livestock who are grazing on eligible grazing lands that you would not normally have to do as far as water transportation. And then we do provide some additional feed purchased above normal for honeybees, but primarily today, we're going to focus on those top three. So as we move to the next slide, let's talk about additional mileage for transporting livestock feed above normal. So basic criteria, we must have eligible livestock, and those are grazing livestock for commercial use. We must have, those livestock must have been owned, similar, just the same as, Brad, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, Pat. You bet.
Okay. Those livestock, just like LFP, you must have, risk in those livestock, whether it's owned, cash leased, under contract, during the 60 calendar days prior to the beginning date of the drought. Those livestock must be physically located in the county that meets that eligible criteria. Same as LFP, producers must have risk in eligible livestock and risk in eligible grazing lands to participate. And then ultimately, producers must be going additional miles above what they normally would to get feed for those livestock. As we move on to the next slide, just some continued eligibility and kind of payment, how the payments work for transporting feed above additional miles. So what FSA is looking to do is reimburse producers for 60% of feed transportation costs above what they normally would have incurred in a year. If we have individuals that meet that historically underserved criteria, that would be looking at 90%. What ELAP takes into consideration or excludes for the payment calculation would be the first 25 miles and distances above 1,000 miles. So really what we're looking at is additional miles that were traveled above the 25, which we've considered into the normal commute, and then inside of anything inside 1,000 miles. The per mile rate that was set for 2023 is $6.60. And then also, just as a quick reminder on ELAP is that, this is a self-certification program. So when we do one of these ELAP applications, it's going to be the producer's responsibility to certify that they've met this criteria, but they'll want to make sure to hold on to their trucking receipts for their mileage information and any other documentation that's going to be beneficial for them to hold on to for at least 3 years if there was in the event of an audit or a spot check. When we're hauling livestock to feed, so moving animals to eligible feed as a result of the drought, the criteria is exactly the same as if we were going to get feed. But instead, we're going to look at it exactly the same. We're going to reimburse producers at 60% of livestock transportation costs above what they normally would have in a year. We're going to exclude 25 miles and anything above 1,000 miles. We're going to use $6.60 per mile as the rate. And then we're just talking about the exact same thing as we want to keep records of that information so that we know down the road, if we're ever pulled, that we'd have that information available to us. When we look at water transportation, it just has a little bit different a look to it. Producers must have risk in both the livestock and the grazing land, as we've talked about before. That water must be transported to eligible livestock on eligible grazing land. So when we look at transportation of water, those animals are still out in that eligible pasture, and they're in need of water in one way or the other, and we're going to provide assistance by transporting that water. A couple key criteria is that they would have had to have had adequate watering systems or facilities before the disaster designations or before the drought conditions. And in a normal year, they would not normally be required to transport water to the producer, to the eligible livestock. What we look at as far as compensation in the payments are for costs associated with water transport equipment fees, labor, and contracted water transportation. We do not look at the cost of the water itself. When we look at these, how this formula works, the payment formula is going to use the national average price per gallon to transport water, and then some additional factors that are included. The significant difference between the livestock forage program and in the emergency livestock assistance program, which is ELAP, is the requirement to file a notice of loss under ELAP. Under LFP, that requirement is not there, but ELAP does have a notification of filing a notice of loss, and producers must file that within 30 days of when the loss is apparent. So if a producer is in a situation where they realize they're going to need to go additional miles to get feed, that they're going to have to transport their livestock further than what they normally would have in order to get to grass, they're going to want to contact that office as soon as possible to file a notice of loss. That's kind of a high level overview of ELAP. ELAP is extremely diverse in what it has the availability to offer to producers. And really, I encourage all producers to contact their local office to see what might fit for their operation, because it does have a lot of facets to it.
Pat, I would take off from there and note that ELAP, your first slide on ELAP noted that the official title of that program really today is Emergency Assistance for Livestock, Honeybees, and Farm-Raised Fish. Well, that doesn't fit easily into an acronym, so I appreciate that ELAP is still the right acronym. Yeah. But it reminds you how broad that program really is. I've heard it described as that's essentially the disaster assistance program for all livestock that don't fit in LFP and LIP. We've talked about LFP. LIP is the livestock indemnity program for death losses. We haven't specifically focused on that today, but fundamentally ELAP does cover a very broad range of possible losses and perils. There are some questions specifically to that. You mentioned relative to transporting feed that there is a specific cost formula, 60 cents per mile, before you calculate the percentage payment. On the water side, we had a question and it showed up on your slide. The payment formula uses a national average. It doesn't say that there is a rate yet determined. Is that something that is still in development, or when does that rate get determined?
I think that rate is probably almost set. But when I do have that my hands on that information for sure, we'll for sure send that out as far as what that rate is.
And that isn't about a distance haul. That is really about a broader measure of the cost of hauling water
Exactly.
based on a per gallon charge. You're not hauling water 1,000 miles like you might have to haul feed. So,
right.
Okay. All right. So the cost of water is yet to come, but will certainly be known. Did I see, was there a cost of hauling livestock?
Really what we're looking at is that mileage rate is how we're looking at that, similar to as we're going additional miles to get feed. We're going to use that $6.60 per mile outside of the 25 miles, which we consider, the normal, and then under 1,000 miles. So we're going to use that same, the formula is almost identical to the additional miles for feed, but as if we're moving livestock to feed.
Okay. All right. So that per mile rate for those categories is the same thing. Okay.
Yes.
All right. The one question here specifically about ELAP. ELAP is available in disaster counties, or is it available to producers that can document a loss regardless of which county they're in?
It had an ELAP application or application would take place in a county that has met the drought criteria for ELAP purposes. The one thing about ELAP is as diverse as it is, we've seen, ELAP's utilized for all sorts of different disasters.
Mhm.
But when we're looking at specifically on drought, and we're looking at applying, we would have to meet that drought criteria in the county where those livestock are located.
If that criteria is met, that's not exactly the same thing then as the LFP criteria, correct?
Well, how we get to that
Yeah.
information is different. So in particular, for LFP, you have to meet the certain criteria within the normal grazing season. When we look at ELAP, we would only have to meet the criteria for 1 week in the grazing season for let's say D2, how we have to meet 8 consecutive weeks in the grazing season for LFP.
Mhm.
When we look at the calendar year for ELAP, if we had 7 weeks leading up to the grazing season in D2, and in the first week of the grazing season, we're D2 again, we've met that 8 consecutive weeks in the calendar year and ultimately qualify for ELAP. So there's a real difference in how we look at the drought monitor and whether or not it opens up ELAP or what date it opens up ELAP.
And then to follow up on that, if it triggers, does it remain triggered for the rest of the grazing season, or is it dependent upon week to week what the drought map shows?
Yep, really good question. Once we trigger, we can continue to implement throughout the year.
Okay, great. One more question here about ELAP, specifically, just to clarify the math. The 660 per mile rate for hauling feed or hauling livestock, that's the rate before the adjustment, right? So is it 660 times 60% equals 396 paid, or is 660 the adjusted rate?
The 660 is not the adjusted rate. That's the full rate. So we'd look at the total miles, the difference between what you normally would and what you've had to go beyond it, multiply by the 660, and then we would take that 60% factor of that.
Okay, someone's done the math and they say that's 396 a mile. So,
Well, perfect. I think, yeah, if you would want to look at it like that, you definitely could. Yeah.
gotcha. Okay. Pat, let's continue on the discussion here on some emergency haying and grazing on CRP to make sure that we make progress here, and we'll come back to many more questions as we go.
Okay. All right. So yeah, moving on. I do think the next slide that we have on the screen, since I'm not able to see it, but I believe it was an example that we gave.
Oh, yes, it was an example. That's correct.
I think that, we've put up an example as just a general, really high level look at a situation that would qualify under ELAP when we're looking at having to go additional miles above normal to get feed. And so as that example reads, Mr. Smith grazes livestock in Dundee County on native pasture that he owns. In a normal year, Mr. Smith hauls 10 loads of cornstalk bales for feed from Mr. Jones, who lives 35 miles away. Due to the drought in 2023, Mr. Smith was not able to purchase cornstalk bales from Mr. Jones, and instead he had to purchase them from Mr. Johnson in South Dakota. Mr. Smith had to haul 10 loads of bales, 225 miles instead of the usual 35 miles. So that's just kind of an example, hopefully that our producers can relate to and say, I had a situation where I normally get it from this individual. I don't have access to that this year because of the drought. And instead I had to go further to get that. That's the exact criteria of what we're looking for under ELAP when we're looking at additional miles. So just wanted to put that out there as a very generic and simple example for our producers and ranchers to relate to.
Okay. Pat, that brings up two questions, however.
Sure.
Like any good story problem here. 225 miles is 190 miles further than the usual distance,
Mhm.
but it's 200 miles further than the 25-mile criteria. So which number counts in the equation?
So what we're going to do when we load that into an ELAP software is going to be, we're going to load the total miles that you had to travel. We're going to load the normal commute miles that the producer certifies to. And then we're going to look at the difference of those. The criteria that's set for the 25 miles. So I believe, if I explain this correctly, is we're going to look at the 190.
190. Okay. And relative to those miles, are those paid both way, or is that paid one way, or what's the?
Yep, that's a good question. We used to, which is a topic of change in ELAP just recently. We originally did not look at compensating for what we would call empty miles, but we are now, ELAP is now authorizing some flexibility there to take a look at empty miles.
Okay.
ELAP is ever changing, and within the last couple weeks itself, we've received additional flexibilities under ELAP.
Okay, let's park those questions in for the moment then, and keep you moving through the CRP questions, or the CRP content.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so we'll just real quickly touch on the flexibilities that emergency haying and grazing allows under drought conditions. As we look at the drought monitor and how triggering mechanisms work for CRP and emergency haying and grazing, there we're looking at probably the least restrictive, where if a county hits D2 at any time during the program year, it meets the general criteria to release acres for emergency haying and grazing. As we look at it today on the May 4th map, we've got all counties that have met it at some point during the program year. And the important thing to remember about CRP is that program year runs on a fiscal year. So when we look at program year 2023, we're looking at October 1 to September 30th of this year. So October 1 of 2022 to September 30th of 2023. So we've got all counties that have met that initial criteria to release acres for emergency haying and grazing. There is a secondary option for qualifying for emergency haying and grazing. If a county does not hit D2, but they felt like they've had a 40% loss in forage production in the county, they do have the opportunity as a local county committee to request to authorize emergency haying and grazing. But in this situation with the drought conditions that we're in, we would not have to worry about that situation because all counties have met the general criteria under the drought monitor. Another way that we utilize emergency haying and grazing is if there's a natural disaster and USDA determines that emergency haying and grazing can be of assistance. We saw a little bit of this in the 2019 Missouri River flooding, where livestock needed locations to go to because of the pasture lands that were flooded, and we were able to authorize some usages under emergency haying and grazing to move those animals to CRP to support them for the time being. The one thing that I will mention about emergency haying and grazing, as we look at counties that have qualified year after year after year, it can get a little dicey or a little bit difficult when we look at ensuring that cover out there complies with your CRP contract. If we're looking at authorized emergency haying and grazing for 1, 2, maybe 3 years in a row, we still want to make sure that grass out there is still meeting the requirements of the contract provision. So I know as we move year to year and authorized emergency haying and grazing, it's really important to work with your local FSA office, your technical provider, which is NRCS, to ensure that, as a producer, you're knowledgeable of those types of provisions when we look at emergency haying and grazing back-to-back years. Just a couple of notes on emergency haying and grazing. There is no rental payment reduction under emergency hay and grazing. Most importantly, when a producer intends to emergency hay and graze, they must do that and put that request in writing. They must receive written approval in writing from FSA before commencing to hay and graze. So as normal with a lot of FSA programs, a producer is going to come in. They're going to talk about their intent to do this, to take advantage of the emergency hay and grazing. FSA is going to work with NRCS, creating a plan. And then ultimately that producer is going to receive written approval that they may start that activity. General eligibility: we cannot hay and graze on the same acreage in the same program year. CRP1 participants may rent or lease the haying or grazing privileges to another producer. And then we're always going to be mindful of the primary nesting season in Nebraska, May 1 through July 15th. Haying is not authorized during that time frame. We do allow some grazing during the primary nesting season, but that's going to be at a significantly reduced stocking rate. So that's kind of just a general overview of emergency haying and grazing, and some of the flexibilities that it allows when drought conditions happen. And I'll be happy to take any questions on that.
Well, Pat, there are a couple questions, and including some that I've sort of ruminated on for quite some time. Emergency haying and grazing here comes in response to the drought conditions, and that might be that the drought monitor triggers that need automatically, and it might be that the county committee requests designation as a disaster county or as an approved county for emergency haying and grazing. So a couple avenues how it might happen. But we've had counties that have been unfortunately in drought for multiple years here in a row. How many years in a row can you use emergency haying and grazing? Are there limits on within a CRP contract? There used to be sort of questions on how many times it could be hayed and grazed. Do any of those limits still apply, or is it purely a function of maintaining the cover, maintaining the quality of the stand?
That's a really good question, and it's been a heavily debated topic, from an administration standpoint. But generally, when we distinguish between what's considered managed haying or managed harvesting and emergency, managed haying and grazing, which is authorized under your contract, has a specific year requirement, whether it's 1 out of every 3 years, whether it's 1 out of every 5 years, depending on when your contract was approved. But every time that emergency haying and grazing qualifies or is authorized, it resets that clock. So in essence, there is no stopping point for emergency haying and grazing, as it resets that clock on when you're allowed to hay and graze every time that it hits. Now, the real concern obviously is ensuring that cover is protected and that cover is maintained. When a producer applies for emergency haying and grazing, we're going to lean on our technical service provider, NRCS, to determine that we've got the stand height out there, that we've got the diversity, that we've got what we need in order to authorize that haying or grazing under emergency. So that review is done each time that individual applies.
Okay. 2 more questions relative to that haying and grazing. If a producer already has a managed haying and grazing practice under traditional CRP sign up, they're already using a managed haying and grazing practice. What does that do or not do to the emergency haying and grazing opportunity?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, similar to what I was talking about earlier, that if a producer's on a system where they might hay a third, in a 3-year rotation, if they qualify for emergency haying and grazing, that will reset that clock and they can start that, they have the opportunity to start that over. And if they hay it under emergency, they would start over again at that point after that.
Okay. All right. This gets technical then. Under managed haying and grazing, they take a payment reduction, to my knowledge, right?
Yes.
If they're in a managed haying and grazing practice, but then emergency applies, does the payment reduction still apply?
So similar to that, what we've seen is if obviously right now here, we're in the grazing season. And so, there wouldn't be any haying going on right now. But most of the time, if we can catch those situations fast enough where an individual has an intent to manage hay, let's say on July 16th after the grazing season, and they've qualified for emergency haying, we would do our best to switch that over and have that individual reapply under emergency so that there would not be any penalty or reduction under their contract, and ultimately they wouldn't have to pay to hay that.
Great. Okay.
So there's a little
Thanks.
bit of a timeline. There's a little bit of a time frame and a give and take on when we can do that. But most certainly, if you have the intent of managed haying and then are authorized for emergency, we can switch that over and they can take it under emergency.
Okay. All right. We have had such great questions rolling in and discussion here that I know we're going to run long at this point. So I'm going to beg the indulgence of those that can hang around longer than the 1 hour time frame here. But in lieu of, or in sense of time, Pat, let's move on to the discussion that Ben brings to the table here briefly on the emergency loan program.
Sure. Yep.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Pat. And again, for those on, welcome you today. Good afternoon to those in the East and good morning to a few in the West. So Pat's touched on a lot of the farm program side. I'm going to talk about a couple in-house tools that we have in our toolkit that are more loan related when we have a disaster. So the emergency loan program, what it is, it is just that, a loan program that's available to producers in counties that are impacted by a designated presidential or secretary of ag disaster. So, in Nebraska, we recently, as of March 31st, with the drought beginning on April 1st and the grazing season, we had 78 counties in Nebraska that were declared what's called a fast track designation due to drought. And 55 of those were part of the designation, and then 23 more were wrapped in because they were contiguous counties. We also have 4 other counties in the state that are kind of bordering counties to surrounding states that are contiguous to disaster designations for drought that are wrapped up in those. And so in total, we have about 82 counties in Nebraska that would currently be eligible for an emergency loan from FSA, again, if all other eligibility criteria was met. So what is the emergency loan program? It's, in terms of loss, you'd have to have at least 30% loss in your crop production. And so for this current round of 2023, drought disaster designations, we really probably obviously haven't realized any 2023 loss yet. The nice part is you have 8 months from the time of the disaster designation to apply for that emergency loan. So really for the bulk of the Nebraska counties, you'd have until December 1st of this year, December 1st, 2023, to apply for any emergency loan assistance. So you'll have time as we go throughout the year to realize what that loss might be. Pasture is a little bit tricky. That's going to depend on the calculations we run are really dependent upon a little bit on stocking rate. Depends on how long you have them out there and when you pull those animals off. And then potentially how much feed you have to buy to get you through the remainder of what we would normally consider to be the grazing season. That's all going to calculate sometimes into that, pasture loss you might have. Some other eligibility issues, it's available for those who are unable to receive credit from commercial sources. And so if you're a producer who currently has their loans or your operating loans with a private bank or maybe the farm credit system, and you have the ability to get any type of emergency assistance that you might need due to drought with your current lender, FSA is going to ask that you do that. This emergency loan credit is designed for those who don't have that ability or maybe get turned down from that assistance from a commercial lender. It can be used to restore, replace essential property. It can be used to pay production costs throughout the year, potentially even pay, essential family living expenses that you might have for your family. Could be used to refinance debts, certainly. So, a big one is obviously going to be the potential need to buy hay, maybe where you otherwise wouldn't have had to. The maximum loan amount on the EM loan program is $500,000. If that's not enough, there are, again, other tools in the toolkit. We can utilize potentially our direct operating loan program, which has a separate $400,000 limit. A couple other eligibility criteria that aren't listed on the screen there that I do want to point out is, number one, you got to own or operate a farm or land that's located in one of those counties that was either declared as part of the disaster or is contiguous to a declared disaster county. And then you've got to be an established operator. So you can't just be a third-party landowner that has no stake in the operation. You'd have to actually have to be the operator as well. The last two things I'll mention for eligibility is you'd have to be able to collateralize any emergency loan that we would make. So you're going to have something that provides FSA security for that loan we make to you. And then the last thing is you'd have to have repayment ability or show repayment ability, just like you would for any other loan you'd get in order to repay that emergency loan. The other, and I'll call it this disaster set aside program, is really an in-house program. So if you're a producer that already has a direct FSA loan outstanding, and you run into a situation where you're in a disaster county, this is more of a short-term Band-Aid fix that would allow you to take the maybe scheduled payment that you just missed on your FSA loan, or one that's upcoming here in 2023 or shortly thereafter, and basically set that installment aside to the back of the note. So for example, if you've got a real estate loan with us and there's 20 years left on that loan and your payments may be due December 1st this fall, but because of the issues with drought and the impacts in your operation that you're not going to be able to make, you're going to be short, you're not going to be able to make that payment come December 1, you can apply for a disaster set aside where we take that December 1 payment and we set it back 20 years to the back of your note that's left. Obviously, when you get to the back of that note, you might have a double payment or greater, but the hope would be that you could catch up basically over the course of the remainder of that loan. So again, short-term fix for our in-house borrowers that we currently have available to you. A couple other points I just want to make as it ties to EM loans before I open it up for any questions here is, always remember we can't have a duplication of benefits. And so Pat talked about LFP, for example. If we have somebody that applies for an emergency loan and we end up making them a loan, and they also received LFP assistance, let's say, because we're talking about having to pull cattle off grass early, we're going to deduct that LFP assistance that they've already received from any qualifying loan they might be eligible for under the emergency loan program. Same way on a crop loss that you might have. We're going to look at the crop insurance proceeds that you might have received or received this fall, and we would deduct that before we factor in what your eligible emergency loan that you might be available for. So that's kind of a quick overview, Brad. I'd open it up to any questions if there are any.
Ben, I have one question that I would like you to address, because it's a broader sort of overreaching question of how does the disaster designation process actually occur? Some of these programs are dependent upon there being a disaster designation. Some of these programs like LFP, there might be, or ELAP, there might be a dual path to eligibility, but tell us very briefly, given our time, but how does the disaster designation process occur? What's the role of the county committee? What's the role of I don't have the name right, but a local sort of ag assessment committee that tracks conditions? How does that work?
Well, it's a little bit different. So for emergency loans and then potential eligibility for disaster set asides, so when we're talking those loan tools, Brad, it's strictly upon a presidential or secretarial disaster designation. So it's got to come from the president, or it's got to come from the Secretary of Ag.
Mm-hmm.
We do have a little bit of expanded authority if it's the FSA administrator that declares that disaster, but it's really not reliant upon the other stuff. So there's ways we get up to that point, but at the end of the day, it's going to have to take a presidential or secretarial disaster designation to qualify potentially for any EM loan or disaster set aside assistance.
So the designation comes down from Washington, D.C.
Comes down from Washington. Correct.
The request for a designation goes up to D.C. Do I remember that?
It does. And honestly, it's really tied to the drought monitor at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So for example, on this recent, fast track drought designation we had for EM loans in Nebraska, where it basically encapsulated, 78 counties. The main triggers are you had to be in a D2 state on the drought monitor for 8 or more consecutive weeks, or your county would have had to have been categorized as D3 or D4. And so again, if you met it because of any one of those, you're going to be part of the disaster designation, or if you were a county contiguous to one of those designations.
Right. Okay. I want to bring Shannon into the discussion here. Shannon is our extension educator, extension ag economist, serving from North Platte. Shannon, I want you to talk briefly about the record keeping and the management decisions producers make. And then we will come back to the group here to take questions as we go into overtime on our webinar this afternoon.
That sounds good. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us. So hold on just a second. Is that showing up?
Shannon, we see we see the presentation. So you're good.
It's always good because you never know sometimes with this stuff. So, all right. So I'm just going to have a brief discussion with y'all about things that I'm sure you've heard of before and we've talked about, but just some different ideas and different ways to potentially do this. Just some ideas. So we're going to talk about trigger dates, stocking rates, and some records, and also a little bit of decision making. So I do have to apologize because some of these trigger dates have passed, but they are important to talk about. And given the ongoing drought that's happened, just to kind of keep it in your mind for now and for the future. So by April 1, you kind of want to look at previous growing seasons precipitation and then dormant season precipitation from October to March and kind of see, is there a lack of soil moisture in early April, and how will that potentially impact your growth from cool season grasses, things like that. If it's exceptionally dry, that is the time to consider potentially reducing stocking rates by 10 to 20% if you're on a cool season dominated rangeland. So April 15th to May 10th. By this time, you kind of have your 30 to 45 day precipitation forecasts and have a good level of reliability. So if you have above average temperatures and average to below average precipitation predicted at that point, additional reductions in stocking rates may need to happen. So, and should be planned for. So May 20th to June 10th, some of your forages are going to be completing production by then, at least if you're in the western part of the state. And it could be in its like wheatgrass is in its rapid growth window. So, and then from March to May, precipitation, you want it to be 50 to 75% of the long-term average, or again, you're going to have to consider reducing stocking rates at that point by 30 to 40%. I know that's very difficult for many of us to consider, but it's been very dry for a long time. And so unfortunately, these are the things a lot of people are having to think about right now. June 15th to June 30th. At that point in time, approximately 75 to 90% of grass growth on cool season dominated range sites will have happened. So rainfall after late June results in limited benefit to cool season grass, but it could still benefit warm season grass. Again, it just depends on your pasture and your rangeland that you have. So from June to July, you want to look at your precipitation and available soil moisture. It's really important for that warm season grass growth. So hopefully my fingers are crossed that we'll get some. Supposedly we're supposed to get rain here today in North Platte, but it is a beautiful sunny day. So we shall see. And then July 15th, precipitation after the state's going to kind of have limited benefit to warm season tall grass production, but it can still result in some forage growth from short grass warm season species such as buffalo grass and blue grama. And then in September, from the 1st to the 15th, your smooth brome grass or other cool season dominated pastures, hopefully we'll have some adequate precipitation by then, and hopefully we'll have enough for fall. So, but just kind of some thoughts on record keeping, because we've talked a lot about different programs and stuff. We all know it's a good idea to keep records. We all keep records in different ways, but how do we do that? So there's a lot of different options. I actually have a friend that for her calves, she creates a folder on her cell phone and takes pictures of her herd every year because it's date stamped and time stamped. And she has geotagging. Y'all, I'm not that techie. So, but it does show you where it's located. And so it is a good way to keep track of it. I have some other friends that are extension agents that in their research fields for their calf crop, they actually take pictures of the forage as the season goes along in order to help identify any potential problems or how the grass is growing or the forage is growing, but also potential for like invasive pests. Unfortunately, that's a thing. I feel like that's happened more and more often in the last few years. So that record keeping is just becoming more and more crucial, especially for programs like this. And there's just lots of ways to keep track of records, both for financial and inventory. I mean, a lot of people use Quicken or QuickBooks. Excel's a good one. These are great for financial, but like pen and paper does not hurt anybody as far as that goes for both your physical and financial inventory. This is my least favorite option, but it does happen. At least somebody's keeping records, though. That's important. This is the one that my dad uses the most, to be honest. He loves the red book. He writes everything down and dates it, and then it gets transferred to an actual physical calendar. In my family, is like we keep one on the fridge, and then my mom transfers it to an Excel sheet. I feel like that probably happens with a lot of people. You could tell that I'm like a farm and ranch kid because this is what I grew up with and I'm most familiar with. But I know a lot of people that have like, there are apps on your phone, there's Google Sheets and things like that. So there's lots of options, but I think the important thing is not only do we use these for oftentimes for tax record keeping purposes, but production decisions, keeping track of when we're calving, but it's also, these can be utilized for some of these programs. And most importantly for decision making, I think, especially right now, given the current situation with the weather and everything, it is an ongoing thing. And just keeping track of that stuff somewhere is really, really important. Like I said, for my family, the easiest option has been, again, like pencil and paper for many years, but we're getting up with it. So we're doing Excel, we're doing a little more now, but yeah. So I think record keeping is just an important conversation to have. So yeah. And it was very short. Thank you,
All
Brad.
right. Well, Shannon, thank you. I'll let you stop sharing there and we'll bring
Okay.
you and Pat and Ben back into the discussion.
Yeah.
I have some quick hitting questions. Thank you to the majority of you that are still with us. Hopefully you're finding the information valuable and worth the extra time here. But I want to do let's call it a lightning round. Quick hitting questions. Two questions come in with sort of the same basic issue. A pasture owner rents the pasture land out, but maybe on a per head per day basis or on a cash rent based on availability of grazing capacity and availability to stock. That pasture owner doesn't have an interest in the livestock, but they're still feeling the loss because that pasture is not being grazed. Do they have any compensation from LFP, or are they stuck without assistance there?
It's a really good question, Brad. And ultimately, the way that the provisions are written is that we must have an eligible livestock owner and then an eligible livestock owner who has eligible grass that they have risk in. So we see this question many times in regards to risk in grass and livestock, or excuse me, in landowners that may not have eligible livestock, but they have grass that's lost. And ultimately, we can only follow the provisions that we have, and that's you must have qualifying livestock and qualifying grass.
Okay. I might suggest an important question for them may be look at the role of PRF, the pasture range and forage insurance product, determine whether the landowner has eligibility there, given that risk of lack of grazing affects them in that way. Okay. Next question. Here's a producer that raises hay, typically sells forage, but has to keep it back to feed their herd. Do they have any assistance under the ELAP program or because they are using their own and not purchasing feed, are they not eligible?
So when we're looking at drought, LFP is our designed program for grazing or forage losses, and then ELAP is designed to help with those additional. So whether it's additional miles, whether it's traveled, or it's additional miles to move livestock or get feed, that component of ELAP, which is available for other disaster events, is not available there for drought conditions.
Mm-hmm. So the protection that person has when they had to feed their own hay as opposed to sell it is hopefully they're covered by LFP, not by ELAP. Okay. Couple math questions going back to the ELAP assistance on transportation. The per mile rate for hauling feed or hauling livestock was multiplied by 60%. Is the per gallon rate for water also multiplied by 60%?
There are other factors. We did not include them in the presentation. And right off the top of my head, I can't give them to you. But bringing us back to ELAP in general, whether we're looking at empty miles, which I had mentioned earlier, when that applies to moving the transportation of livestock, we're looking at empty miles. But ELAP is so diverse, ELAP is so multifaceted that I really would suggest in a specific situation that a producer may have, that they contact their local office, they sit down, we identify the entirety of their operation and what they're looking at, and then look for ways to apply ELAP to that situation.
Okay. All right. It really does come back to talk to your FSA office and work through it, right?
It really does, because how we can utilize ELAP, it can be really specific to how a person carries through with their operation.
Right. Okay, another math question. This one on LFP. LFP pays a rate based on the degree of drought losses and effectively the number of months of payments. But the payment factor, the monthly payment factor, is a function of feed costs. When will we know what the 2023 payment rate is on those feed costs that will be paid out on LFP? Or is that set and is that available?
That's a really good question. Those rates are set for 2023. It just happened a couple weeks ago. Unfortunately, I don't have them at my disposal right now with my laptop being down. Otherwise, I would get them for you. But any of your local service centers have those rates available to you. Like I said, they just came out a few weeks ago. So they are set and in place.
They are there. The math is ready to do. Okay.
Yep.
Ben, a couple questions on the emergency loan program. What's the interest rate, or at least what's the comparable rate on that compared to other loan programs?
Yeah, it's a good question. The interest rate is 3.75%, and that's a fixed rate. And so currently our regular operating loan program is at 5.0%. So there certainly is an interest rate benefit to going under the EM loan program if you qualify for it.
Okay. Couple CRP questions. One question comes in, a producer that is in managed haying and grazing. So that question we talked about earlier, Pat, relevant here. They're in managed haying and grazing. Let's say a third is hayed or grazed each year. If this year is an emergency haying and grazing opportunity, does that say that they can hay or graze everything this year and then continue next year going back to the third graze, or third? Is that, did we understand that correctly?
That's a really good question, because haying and grazing is also affected by LFP and the release of, or the qualification for the criteria for LFP. So under emergency haying and grazing criteria, as it sits without LFP qualifying in that county, producers have the ability to hay 100% of the acres on that contract under emergency haying and grazing. If LFP triggers in that county, which is unfortunately probably by the end here, it will be the majority of our counties, That is reduced to 50% of the acres and also restricts some of the practices that haying and grazing under emergency is allowed on. So just with that criteria up front, but when we circle back to the question that the individual asked about a third and a third and a third, if that individual elects to hay, let's say hay all of it, so that cover is completely removed, they would have to wait to what their provisions say. Maybe it's 1 out of every 3 years. Well, they would have to wait the additional years to get to the third in order to start haying again if they hayed all of it.
Okay, so important criteria. Don't just jump back in and assume that you know what you can do or that what you're eligible to do.
And that, yes, Brad, and that's exactly right. And just as a reminder, whether you're managed haying or emergency haying, all of those you must get written approval and apply for under the county office, and they will steer you in the right direction on what eligibility you now have if you elect to utilize that emergency and when the next available time to hay is or graze is as you move forward.
Okay. Another question actually takes us back to the blizzards this winter, not the current drought. But if an operation, one of the programs we didn't even talk about today, the livestock indemnity program pays for death losses due to those abnormal disaster events. But also part of the abnormal loss due to the run of blizzards was the number of producers that had to dip into their hay inventory to get through the winter. That means that they don't have hay inventory to feed now. Is there any coverage that looks back at what they had to feed sort of abnormally high over the winter? Or are they simply out of forages now and dealing with the potential that they have to buy and transport forages?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, and it's a loaded question.
It is.
In the sense that ELAP and its assistance for additional feed purchased above normal. So if we had to feed more because of, let's say, a blizzard, that time frame that a county met the criteria for a blizzard, there is availability to compensate producers for that extra feed that they had to feed during that time. Now, a reminder, there's some notice of loss criteria that was required to be filed. However, I will tell you that under ELAP, I would still contact your office because we've received a little bit of flexibility due to the nature of the storms that we've had in 2022 and 2023 and the need for filing a notice of loss. So if there's producers that have that situation and they believe that they had to do that, I would still contact your office. The tricky part with that is that with blizzards, with extreme weather events, there is specific criteria that has to be met to qualify that event and whether or not it's eligible. And that's really on a county by county basis. It's reviewed to determine whether or not the snowstorm or the blizzard met that criteria. So it's really hard to give you a specific answer, but I would really encourage producers to check that out if that's something that they may feel that happened to them.
So to clarify, that's not dependent upon a disaster designation having been made for that county. That's a local county discussion of whether the blizzard event was really a qualifying event or not.
That's exactly right. Really, where we look at that as far as a disaster qualification is when we use drought for the drought monitor. These other ways that we utilize ELAP are really handled at the local level, and whether or not we've met this specific criteria for whether it's a blizzard would be a perfect example.
Okay. All right. Ben, let me ask you sort of an important question here that encompasses all of the FSA work. What does a producer really need to do to be ready to talk to FSA or to be ready to document records and losses or need for assistance? What's the first step?
Well, when we're talking about the loan programs, I mean, I think the first step generally for most producers is going to be to probably come in and sit down, at your local FSA office and talk with your local loan staff, Brad. And we need to get a little bit of, if you're not a current, FSA loan borrower, we need to get a little bit of handle on just what your operation is, what the loss that you're talking about is, or that you realized. and then what tools we probably have in our loan toolkit that might best fit your situation. So it might be the emergency loan program because your loss is enough to qualify. It might be some of our other in-house programs, whether it be a regular operating loan or whether it be one of those disaster set-aside, programs I mentioned. You're going to need to have some updated financial information. So certainly we're probably going to look for an updated balance sheet and a 2023 cash flow, but then we're also going to have to see some of your production history. So if we're talking about crop losses, we're probably going to need a copy. We will need a copy of your APH records because we're going to need to know what your normal production was, and then what your basically current impacted production was to know what that difference in loss was. We might need to know, again, what your normal number of head of cattle you had on hand for that pasture. So keep good records. I think that goes whether it's a drought or not. But balance sheet, cash flow, and then some of those production records are going to be things that we're looking for as we work through your eligibility and how much assistance you're actually eligible for.
Okay, all right. And a question that gets into leasing arrangements. 3 parts. So very lightning round. You mentioned the need to submit a Form 855 earlier on, Pat. If a landowner doesn't want to sign an 855, how do you document or demonstrate the lease? Is a cash check sufficient, or what do you recommend?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I know we do struggle with that. Right now, the way that LFP is designed, if that landowner is unwilling to sign off on that 855, we unfortunately don't have any sort of outlet to tackle those type of issues currently, and ultimately those acres would be deemed ineligible. It's an issue that I know our administration is at least aware of. We're constantly working on bettering our programs, LFP, ELAP in particular. But right now, unfortunately, we don't really have an outlet in that situation where a landowner is unwilling to acknowledge that producer has risk in that grass.
All right. Well, we certainly can't stop on an answer like that. So a second lease question came up with, would you recommend as a general practice that FSA farm numbers be included in some of the written leases?
I mean, it could be a good idea, but I mean, we could capture just as much information if they're looking at legals, the legals of those acres.
Legal description should be there, right? Okay.
That would be just as sufficient.
Yeah, okay. Then a clarification back to the question we had about someone that leases out the pasture for cash, but doesn't rent it in the case where grazing capacity is down. I said maybe if these disaster programs don't work, that we should see what PRF could do. Notes coming in to say PRF requires you to own the animals as well. Does that suggest for the landowner that's renting out pasture and cash, there really isn't a direct tool that they can use if that rental is based on being able to rent or being able to graze, and then grazing doesn't occur? Are there any tools to help that landowner, or does the only help come if the producer actually rents the land, but then the producer can't graze and the producer is eligible for assistance?
Really, I mean, ultimately that's right. The second part of what you notated, these programs are designed, whether good or whether bad, to compensate individuals that have livestock and have grazing lands. Definitely a hot topic that has been discussed in lengths, but really the outlets that we have are producers that are certifying that they've got risk in both.
Okay, all right. One more question that sits here is, what can we tell a producer to help before they have to sell the animals? I think we got to the discussion earlier about ELAP. So maybe this question really came in before ELAP got started. But short of having to liquidate the animals and then deal with trying to cover losses on animals that I don't have anymore, ELAP's the thing that can help us access some help to get feed now, right?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the FSA portfolio of a drought assistance, ELAP and LFP are the viable options that we have as far as a governmental agency to aid in respects to assistance to producers to hopefully prevent them from liquidating livestock outside of management decisions that they need to make.
Yeah. And ELAP to help transport that feed or those animals. The emergency loan program, Ben, to help fund those feed costs if need be. So.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, we have made our way through what I can only guess is triple overtime. But I thank you for the opportunity to extend on here and discuss a whole realm of questions that have come in. I know there are more questions. Another one just popped, but if those questions continue, I think we can say that the basic answer is start with good records, as Shannon would point to. Start with good records that help you with production decisions. Start with good records that help you be prepared to document what you need for FSA assistance programs, but then also go to communication with the local FSA office and discuss the requirements, the rules, the opportunities, and the detail at hand. Any final comment from the three of you on our panel today?
Brad,
go ahead, Pat. No.
I just thank everybody. As you can see from the array of questions that came in, the answers that are given, the complexity of programs that we offer like ELAP, those answers can change based on people's operations. And so I think the most important part is thanking UNL for allowing us to get the word out there that this is available to our livestock producers, so that they're aware that there is assistance out there.
Yep. And I was just going to reiterate that, to thank you for the opportunity, Brad. And again, that the bottom part of that current slide is probably one of the most important things. There's a lot of information we talked about. It's hard to remember it all, to know what, your specific situation might qualify for. Contact your local FSA office, walk them through your situation, and you're going to, find that to be a big advantage for you, a big help.
Thank you, Ben. And Shannon?
No, I would just agree with everybody else. I think the best option is to contact your local FSA office, because everybody's situation is different and unique in terms of how they operate and their system. And FSA can help you best know what records and how to keep those so that you qualify for hopefully the maximum amount you're able to qualify for. So.
Okay. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Shannon, for being with us. Thank you to our participants online. We have about half of you still online here, an hour and a half into our discussion. And so I appreciate you and the questions you brought to the discussion today. So remember, a recording of this webinar will be posted at cap.unl.edu. It'll be up there soon, as will the slides that come with it. So some of this detail will be embedded there. You can also always find information on other webinars, those that we've done previously, like a previous disaster program, FSA disaster program discussion of the emergency relief program and the pandemic agricultural relief program, a webinar we did about a month or a month and a half ago. So there are lots of good information up there. There was a drought management practices webinar, I believe, up there just last week, all that can help you make some important decisions here as we go. So a recording of this webinar, a recording of those previous webinars are up there on cap.unl.edu. You can also find a schedule of our upcoming webinars, and we encourage you to look and register for those that are of interest. Finally, as you leave, we would appreciate your feedback. If you looked in the chat box, the last message that was posted in the chat box gave you a link to an evaluation form that you can click on your way out the door here. That'll bring up a brief evaluation. Please let us know what you thought of today's program. Give us ideas for what you think we ought to discuss in future webinars as well. With all of that being said, we can now say for sure, have a good afternoon. Thank you for joining us.